Use of Force by Correctional Officers and the Use of Force Continuum by Jasmine Amaya, Miguel Ibarra, Jeremy Garola, and Steve Lopez Bermudez. The use of force by correctional officers is often portrayed in a negative light due to news, social media, and other outlets. Although force is used in many situations across the country in most correctional facilities, how often is it really used and how much force is exerted? Let's talk use of force. What exactly is it and how is it measured? The use of force model or continuum is used by law enforcement and carries into the correctional field. Federal Law Enforcement Training Center use of force model is on the right side of this PowerPoint. It ranges from a simple complaint to a serious assault. And as you can see, the colors are notating the spectrum that the officer assessment and the selection of force the officer chooses to use. And you can see that it is measured on a gradient. A model like this is followed based on the interaction a CO has with an inmate. Based on the situation, an officer will first try to negotiate and resolve the conflict verbally. Eventually, non-lethal force can be used. Lethal force is the last result. In the center of the diagram to the right, there's the situation, and the next outer ring has the different types of situations that a CO is met with. Then the next outer ring has the negotiation stage of what an officer has before he turns to different types of force, which range from lethal to non-lethal. And eventually the situation will end in withdrawing the inmate, isolating him in some way, and constraining them so that he can reassess his actions for the future. Non-lethal force: physical coercion, projectile weaponry, deterrent, a compression-based gun that shoots gelatin projectiles with a force of 17 feet per pound, riot shields, combat lights, high-intensity lights that can strobe and disorient, handcuffs, restraint systems, chemical sprays, taser guns, and various forms of tear gas can be used as non-lethal force. Lethal force. Just like police officers, correctional officers have access to firearms and are trained to use them effectively. It should be noted, however, that not all correctional officers are armed with firearms. The degree varies depending on each individual institution. Now that use of force is defined, how often is it really used? With the police brutality being a major topic in 2020 after senseless murders from several police departments, it is safe to believe that most people think the same happens in prisons. In a 2-year period, there was a total of 352 self-injuries that were documented due to use of force. In other words, inmates injured themselves because they were affected by the use of force of correctional officers. These findings were only documented cases. Relationships. Bad relationships between inmates and correctional officers can lead to violence and use of force. In 2007, the National Inmate Survey found that there were 90,000 cases of inmate and correctional officer encounters where use of force was used. There are female and male correctional officers. There have been cases where both female and male correctional officer use excessive use of force. Detention officers working in the 7 jails of Maricopa County in Arizona in 1996 found that male officers were more likely to use excessive force more than female officers. Many videos on the media showing officers using excessive force. By law, correctional officers use force in many situations, including them protecting themselves or others, protecting the institution they work in, commanding orders, or when an inmate fails to cooperate. Officers are supposed to be ready to use force. 3 factors of readiness to use force are: 1, how the officer receives support from the institution; 2, how the officer receives support from its supervisor; and 3, how the officer's relationships and influence over their inmates are. Testing this, survey data was drawn from a random sample of 2,077 staff working in all 112 federal prisons operating in 2005. Female correctional officers had significantly less assault attacks with inmates than male correctional officers. Prison settings? Not necessarily. The media and news outlets may skew information and make us believe that relationships between the inmates and officers aren't the greatest. One prime example of how COs and inmates coexist is the story of Kevin Huxell, a correctional officer from the Washington State Penitentiary. Being Anthony DeFro was stabbed several times with scissors in a laundry room. Unfortunately, by the time CO Kevin Huxell arrived, DeFro had died from the wounds. Huxell tried emergency resuscitation while covering his wounds. An ambulance arrived and pronounced him dead again, but Huxell did not give up on the inmate and found a pulse. DeFro died 4 times and was eventually given open heart surgery. Because of Huxell's urgency and willingness to save an inmate's life, DeFro was able to live. COs can coexist and even care for their inmates. Let's apply the use of force to a situation that faces correctional officers. There is an inmate with a shank in a block of cells. The officers have used verbal commands and he is not listening. You are the first officer in the cell block with no backup yet. You again use the verbal commands to instruct the inmate to drop the weapon and get down. He refuses. You draw your firearm and again command him to stop. He then throws the knife to the ground and rushes you. What do you do? I'll give you a few moments to think about that. Is now not a deadly threat and must be met with a new level of force. You would have to defend yourself till your fellow officers can back you up. You could push him away and try to take him to the ground and use a vascular neck restraint hold or other holds to keep the inmate from hurting you or even advancing the fight and trying to take your firearm. You could also try and reach for non-lethal force instruments like a taser, baton, pepper spray, or other items. The most important part of the situation is that you take the level of force down from deadly force to just a physical harm because the inmate is no longer a deadly threat to the officer and the officer would no longer be operating in the improved use of force continuum. Example of improper use of force that can be graphic. After watching the video, we will discuss why the actions in the video were wrong. used excessive force on the inmate due to a few reasons. The inmate was shot with a round that was not approved to be used in that capacity. The officers did not have an urgent need to go into the cell and incapacitate the inmate. The officers did not recognize that he was going through a mental issue and should have responded differently. The officers did not report the incident truthfully and stated a lie so that the inmate was away from the door when firing the round and lied about the ricocheting round hitting the inmate and not the officer hit him directly in the leg. Falsifying documents like that can cost the prisons hundreds of thousands of dollars in lawsuits. Different tools for correctional officers to use at each level, statistics, inmate/CO relationships, examples and cases of force, and a video. We hope that we have given you a deeper understanding of how correctional officers operate, what they do, and how to properly judge what force to use for a given situation. With that being said, we need both the inmates to cooperate with the COs better and have the COs be held more accountable for their role inside the prisons and what levels of force that they use.